Okay, students, this is part 2 of the MLA. So let's go ahead and take a look at, again, we're looking at Purdue OWL. I like using Purdue OWL just because it's an online source, so you can get it wherever you're at. But obviously this stuff is all in the Easy Writer as well, back in the MLA section. So yesterday I did a video on what the Works Cited page should contain and what it should look like. So now today we're going to follow that up with how you apply what's in your Works Cited page to your actual text. How you, in other words, cite those different things that are on your Works Cited page within your text. So it's basically just called in-text citation. So that's what we're looking at. And what you do is there's a couple ways to do it. Like it shows here, you can use the person you're quoting. You can use their name in this. Well, first of all, let's start with the parts here. This is what's called the signal phrase. The signal phrase is basically that part that signals, just like it sounds like, it signals that the quote or information to follow comes from some other source. So in this case, we know that because it says Wordsworth stated, we know that this is a source that's by Wordsworth himself. And so that's our signal phrase. The basic part of the signal phrase is actually that right there, Wordsworth stated. And then it goes on to say that what he stated was that Romantic poetry was marked by. Now notice this part does not have quotation marks, and that's because that part is basically just paraphrased, put in the author of this sentence. Like, let's say this paper was being written by somebody named Tom. So Tom is using Wordsworth here as his source, and Tom is basically saying this part here that Wordsworth may have said it in different words. He's basically putting it more succinctly in his own words and saying that poetry is marked by, and then we have the actual quoted material, which is actually word for word what Wordsworth stated. So that's your quote. Okay. Now sometimes you may have, like this one here. Notice, before I move on, take a look at the parenthetical here. This part at the end of the sentence is called the parenthetical, and it's going to be basically just that, a set of parentheses with something in it. Now in this case, it's just a page number. The reason why the only thing in there is just a page number is because we already have the author of the quote, Wordsworth, here, so we don't have to state him here and here. So if we put the person being quoted, if we put their name in the signal phrase, then we don't have to have it here. However, look at this example. Same sentence, Romantic poetry is characterized by the, quote, spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings. So it's the same statement as this one. The only difference is Wordsworth's name isn't mentioned in here in the signal phrase. So instead of, if it's not mentioned in the signal phrase, then it has to be in the parenthetical. So the point is the author's name, or if you don't have an author, then the first few words of the title, well, actually, if you put it in the sentence here, it should be the whole title. But if you put it in here, if you put it in the parenthetical, it only has to be the first 2 or 3 words of the title. But if you don't have an author, then what you put in here is a title, and we'll talk about that more here in a minute. Okay, so in the parenthetical, if you have the last name of the author, and then a space, and then a page number, and that's for a book, for a print source, a book you can actually pick up and read. Okay. Then we have here what we would say is basically a summary or a paraphrase of what Wordsworth said. So you notice there's no quotation marks because it's basically just been put in the author. In this case, in my example case, Tom. If Tom wrote this sentence, then that means Tom put this in his own words and simply paraphrased or summarized something that Wordsworth said. And so you still give credit to Wordsworth because Wordsworth is the one that said it. Even though Tom put it in his own words, he still got it from Wordsworth, so he still has to give Wordsworth credit, and he still has to have the parenthetical at the end. See, So even if you paraphrase something or summarize it, in other words, you take a portion of something and put it in your own words, you still need to give credit to the source it came from, right? Okay. Now, this is what the citation, this stuff right here would have come from. This is what it would look like on a works cited page entry. Notice it's last name, comma, first name, period, just like we talked about in yesterday's video. That's the first thing that should always be in your entry, is last name of the author, comma, first name of the author, period. If you do not have a author, let's say for some reason this one didn't have an author and it was Lyrical Ballads by somebody else and we don't know who it was written by, then Lyrical Ballads would be the very first word here. Lyrical would be the first word, and then ballads. In the same format, it would still be italicized, but it would be first because there's no author, if there was no author. And then if that were the case, instead of having Wordsworth up here, you would just simply say, in the poetry book Lyrical Ballads states that romantic poetry was marked by blah, blah, blah. So you'd simply use the title here where you'd normally use the author if you didn't have an author. Hopefully that makes sense. Just think about that, how that works. If you have an author, the author goes in the state in here, either in the signal phrase or in the parenthetical. But if you don't have an author, then you put the next thing that you would have on your works cited page entry, and that would be the title. Now, it might be the title of a bigger piece of work like this, which would be in italics, or if it's the title of a like an article or something smaller that's a smaller part of a larger thing, then that would probably be in quotation marks, and you'll see that here in a second too. Okay, so just remember that when you are citing something in the text from your works cited page, and this is why I said yesterday it's so important to have your works cited page done first, because then you can make sure that you're using the correct parts of that works cited entry in your in-text citations. Okay, so this part is about in-text citations with print sources that have a known author. Works the same way as this example up here we just looked at. Human beings have been described by Kenneth Burke as symbol-using animals. So there you have the signal phrase, which is this part here. It's just worded differently, but it's still the signal phrase. Having been described by Kenneth Burke is your signal phrase, because it's telling us Kenneth Burke is stating this. Okay. Another example here would be without using Burke's name in the signal phrase, then you would just simply have his name in the parenthetical. So remember, one or the other. His name can be in the signal phrase or it can be in the parenthetical, as long as it's in one or the other. Does not have to be in both. Okay? And again, it shows you what this came from. This Kenneth Burke quote came from this entry. So this is what the entry would look like on a works cited page. Right? Okay, so again, you always take the first thing. You always go by the first thing here as to what you put up here, either here or here. That's the first word, Burke. Again, if we did not have an author and this long title here was what you would use, then you would either use that full title. If you put it in the signal phrase, like right here where I'm circling with my mouse, you would have to use the whole thing if you put it in here. But if you just put it in the parenthetical, you would only have to use like maybe language as or language as symbolic. You know, maybe the first 2 or 3 words is all you'd have to do. As a matter of fact, if your works cited page had 4 or 5 entries and this was the only entry that had the first word was language, then that would be the only word you'd have to put up in here. Does that make sense, hopefully? So just remember the idea, what you're deciding to put in there is basically based on what's going to be easiest for me, your teacher, or somebody else who's reading your paper to be able to find that source. to first be able to look at it here in your writing and then find it back on your Works Cited page. And then from there, be able to use what your Works Cited page entry has in it to find it somewhere in real life, like online or in a book library or something like that. Okay. In-text citations for a corporate author. When a source has a corporate author, it's acceptable to just use the name of the company. So you could use the name of the company if the company is, and that goes for like things like organizations. Like an example might be PETA. I used them yesterday in the video. PETA, People for Ethical Treatment of Animals. If you were citing something from them, it would be acceptable to either start your entry with just the title, or it would be acceptable to use the PETA, People for Ethical Treatment of Animals, as your author. You could actually put them at the very beginning. You could put PETA, P-E-T-A, at the very beginning of it. But you'd actually probably have to write it out. So if you're going to use PETA, for example, as your source, then you would probably have to write it out. You'd have to actually say People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals. Okay. This is what it would look like, as I've been saying, this is what it would look like if you had no author. Okay. If you have no author, then the in-text citation would look something like this. We see so many global warming hotspots in North America, likely because this region has, quote, more readily accessible climate data and more blah, blah, blah. So there's your quote information coming from the source. Here's the source. This is the source's title. And so since there's no author for this article, then that means there's no article or there's no author on the Works Cited entry. See here, this is what the Works Cited entry would look like, right? Notice that in the parenthetical here, they kept the same formatting, so that they keep the quotation marks. And if that were a larger work and it was italicized, then this would be italicized in here. But in this case, it's a smaller work. It's an article from a magazine, Global Warming Early Signs. So in that case, it is in quotation marks. And notice also that the whole thing's not in here. Impact of global warming is not the whole title. The whole title is Impact of Global Warming in North America. But to shorten it up, they just put the first few words. And that's fine. You could put this much, or again, you don't have to put the first word. If the first word is the word a, and, or the, you just put impact of global warming. And also, you just have to put the first word or two, even if it's clear. So in other words, if you had 4 or 5 items on your Works Cited page, and only one of those items started with the first word being impact of something, then you could just put impact even. But you'd still want to put it in quotation marks. Okay? So that's how you do something where the author is not named. There's no known author. Okay, and then there's the rest of these are some that might be a little less likely that you would use, so I'm not going to go into all those. Here's citing authors with the same last names, citing a work by multiple authors. So now this one could be possible. You might come across a source that has maybe 3 or 4 authors in it, or even more. There's material out there that's been written by 7, 8 people, and all of them are named on the book. But what you do is, if you have 2 or 3 authors like this one, or this one's 2 authors, then you first of all would do the Works Cited entry like this: last name, comma, first name, comma, of the first author listed on the actual source. So if it's a journal like this one is, then the first person's name that's mentioned on the article title, under the article title of the journal, that's the person you would put first here. And then you would put and then you'd put the second person's name. And notice the second person's name, you don't have to put last name first. You just put it natural. So it's Best, comma, David and Sharon Marcus. Right? No comma, because this isn't last name first. Okay? And then when you're actually using that, citing that in your actual paper, it would look like this. Best and Marcus argue. So you just use their last names, Best and Marcus, and you put that up in here, either in your signal phrase or at the parenthetical. Best and Marcus argue. That's your signal phrase right there. Argue what? One should read test for what it says on its surface rather than looking for some hidden meaning. Again, we do not have quotation marks, so that means that this part I've highlighted here is either it's probably a summary of a larger bit of material. In other words, this might have been how he summarized a whole paragraph of writing, maybe. So this could be a summary, or it could just be a paraphrase of a sentence that was just as short as this one. But paraphrase, think of the difference between a paraphrase and a summary. A paraphrase is it's basically a rewording of the whole thing that's being said. All the major points are still included in a paraphrase, but it's just put all in your own words. But if you're taking a large piece of work, like a whole paragraph, let's say you had a paragraph that was half the length of this page here, and all you wanted to do was come up with this much information from it, what I've highlighted here, then that would be a summary. You would simply be taking all of what was said in that whole big paragraph and putting it into one short phrase or sentence like this. That's a summary. In other words, you're taking the whole big part and just simply summarizing the gist of it. Right? So paraphrase is when you're trying to maintain the integrity of everything that was said in the paragraph, and so you simply repeat everything in your own words. Whereas a summary is when you take the whole thing and you just break it into just a very short summary of the gist of the whole thing. Okay, I'm going to take a drink here. Now, if you have a source that has 3 or more authors, this used to actually be 4 or more, now they've changed that. That's something else they changed, I think, in 2016. If you have a source with 3 or more authors, then all you have to do is list on your Works Cited entry, you would just list the first name that's listed of the 3. So like there's 3 different people, you would just pick the first name listed. The first name that's listed is always considered the main author. So you pick the first name listed, put them in there like this, and then follow it with et al., which is Latin, I think, or Greek, for and others. Let me see, it says here, et al. Just means and others. I think it's Latin. Anyway, so that just means and others. So you can simply use that. And then here, when you're now going to use that in your paper, in your essay, you would again either put it like this in your signal phrase, which is what this part is, according to so-and-so, that's your signal phrase. In this case, it's according to Frank et al. Or you could list the information without his name and just put Frank et al. In the parenthetical. Either way. Okay. Notice that this one is a direct quote because it's got quotation marks. Whereas this one does not have quotation marks anywhere in it. So that's a summary or a parenthetical, summary or a paraphrase. Okay. If I'm going too fast for this, just remember you got rewind. You can always go back and listen to these things again however many times you need to, or as I've suggested before, take notes as we go along. If you write this stuff down and kind of copy this stuff as you're hearing it, you're much more likely to remember it. Okay. And then here's some more things that we don't necessarily need to go into. That's citing multiple works with the same author. You can figure that out if you need to. 2 different articles, you would basically have something like this. Leitner has argued that computers are not useful tools for small children. And then you put that first source material here. Again, notice it's an article title, so it's going to be in quotation marks. And then the page number. Though he is acknowledged elsewhere. So yeah, it's telling you this is from another source. that early exposure to computer games does lead to better small motor skill development in child's second and third year. And then we have a different title. So both titles are just listed in here, and here it tells you, acknowledged elsewhere, it tells you that the source coming up is different from the first one. 2 books by the same author, same thing. But the difference is you have it in italics because it's the title of an entire book rather than just a chapter or from the book or something like that, a smaller piece from the book. Okay. Citing multiple volume works, you're probably not going to have to worry about that. Citing the Bible, this tells you how to cite the Bible in text. Shows you what you should do there. So you might need that, I don't know. Depends on if you decide to use the Bible as a source. Citing indirect sources. Sometimes you may have to use an indirect source. This is, in other words, it's kind of like the idea of a quote within a quote. So notice what it says here. It says, Ravitch argues that high schools are pressured to act as, quote, social service centers, and they don't do that well, end quote. Now, notice that the person's name is Ravitch, but in here it says Wiseman. What that means is the main source this person used was maybe a book written by Wiseman. And within that book that Wiseman wrote, Wiseman, quoted this guy, Ravitch, or gal. So that's why it says QTD, that's short for quoted in. So that means that Ravitch was quoted within Wiseman's work. And then you, say Tom, decided to take that and quote it in yours. So that's how you give credit not only to Ravitch, who originally said it, but to Weiss, where you found it. That's where you found what Ravitch said. That's sounds a little complicated, but just think of it as if you find material that's quoted within another material and you want to use that, this is how you would do it. Quote within a quote. Or a source within a source. Maybe that would be a better way to put it. Okay. Citing non-print sources. Now the difference between citing sources that are non-print, the basic difference, the main thing is that you remember that you still go by the first thing here. You still go by the last name of the author if you have one. See, Werner Herzog's Fitzcarraldo stars Herzog's longtime film partner Klaus Kinski. During the shooting of Fitzcarraldo, Herzog and Kinski were often at odds, blah, blah, blah. So this is a non-print source, and in this case, it's a film. You know, probably Warren Herzog was the director of this film. Okay, so you still go by their last name. You still go by their name for putting giving them credit. Here's another one, Jane Yates. And so in this one, they give her credit. During the presentation, Jane Yates stated. So that, again, this right here is your signal phrase. Jane Yates stated. Okay. Electronic sources. So it works the same way. Electronic sources work the same way. You just use the last name of the author if you have an author listed. Like this one here, you can either put it in here or you can put it in the signal phrase, either way. Or if you have 2 or more authors, 3 or more authors, then you would use the Russell et al., which is, as you can see, that's what they did here. Multiple citations. To cite multiple sources in the same parenthetical reference, just separate them by a semicolon. So it has been discussed elsewhere. So in other words, what is being written about here was discussed by both Burke and Dewey. So you put them both in the same parenthetical, separated by a semicolon. Okay. Citation is not needed and basically to figure out when citation is not needed is just kind of use common sense. If the source material that you're wanting to cite is very well known, you know, if it's like a well-known quote, like from President Kennedy, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. Not very good imitation, but anyway, if that's what you're doing is quoting something that's very famous like that, then you don't have to put Kennedy in there as the author. Everybody knows that, right? So things like that, things that you yourself have said, obviously you don't need to cite yourself, right? So just use kind of common sense. If everybody's heard it, if it's a familiar proverb or well-known quote, common knowledge information, then you don't have to cite it, okay? But having said that, best rule of thumb is when in doubt, cite it. That way you don't have to worry about being hit for plagiarism. Okay? So that's the basics of the in-text citations. That's pretty much it. You just want to make sure that when you cite, here's the important stuff to remember from this, guys. Here's kind of my little end note here to remind you of what's important from here. Number one is you got to always have this. You got to always have some form of signal phrase. And the signal phrase, again, is what is telling your readers that the information is coming from somebody other than you. It's coming from some other source that you will have listed on your Works Cited page. Do not have quoted material in your paper that's not on your Works Cited page, and vice versa. Do not have something on your Works Cited page if you don't actually use it in your text, in your paper. Okay? In other words, everything that's in your Works Cited page should be used in the paper, and the same way, the other way around. Everything that's cited in your paper has to be on your Works Cited page. Okay? So you got to have your signal phrase that states somebody else is speaking, and then you got to have your parenthetical, which is either going to have like a page number, or it might have, in this case, it might have the author and the page number. Now, there's one other thing I want to show you. Let's take a look at some of these other things to see if there's anything important to get from it. Just remember, oh yeah, here's one thing. If you're quoting something and that quote is going to be a long quote, like it's going to take up like 4 lines or more, like these are short quotes. It's fine to do them within your writing. But if you're going to do a long quote, then you need to use what we call block quotes. And this is an example. When citing more than 4 lines of prose, in other words, 4 lines of writing, it's going to take more than 4 lines. See, this obviously would take more than 4 lines. It's like 10 lines here, 8 or so lines. So then you put it in this format, which is called a block quote. In the block quote, you still have your signal phrase. Nellie Dean treats Heathcliff poorly and dehumanizes her throughout the narration. So that tells you that this quote is coming, or this information is coming from the narrative, this paper, and then that ends, instead of with a comma, that ends with a colon. And then you skip a space here, and then you tab in. Now this tab actually should be double tab. So when you tab in for a block quote, it should be tabbed in double tab. Now it's not going to be any big deal if you only single tab it. I guess that's not going to be such a big deal. But just remember that it needs to be tabbed in. And in that case, you don't need quotation marks because just having it in this format shows that it's a quote. Then at the end, you have your period. In this case, the period goes where it belongs, right after the last word. And then you have your parenthetical. So this is obviously a something from Bronte. So just remember that's kind of the big difference, is that it's going to be introduced with a full complete sentence that ends with the colon, and then it's going to be tabbed in and no quotation marks. Now on a regular quotation within a sentence, remember the period always goes after the parenthetical when there is a parenthetical present. Normally the period would go inside of here, right? Normally the period would be in here between the Y and a quotation mark. But when there's a parenthetical present, you put it after that. So that's why it's always there. Same with a comma. Now you see a comma, instead of going here, the comma comes after the parenthetical. So just remember that. The only time that changes is when you have a block quote. Then it changes. See, this in this case you have the period right where it belongs here normally, after the word, last word. Okay, poetry, you keep the poetry in the way it's, the way it's written. You keep it broken up in the stanzas, the way it's in lines when you're doing poetry. Okay. If you have to add something to a quote, like let's say the material that you're quoting has something in it that you feel like without adding this information it's not going to be clear what the quote is talking about, then you add it in by using brackets. Notice here it says, in an essay on urban legends states, some individuals make a point of learning every rumor or tale. See, this person put this in here to make it clear who specifically he's talking about these individuals are. The individuals who retell those legends. That was kind of probably important information to keep in there. So since you add it in, you put it in these brackets. Look like square parentheses. However, the opposite of that is if you remove something or change something, then that's when you use these three periods, which are called ellipses. In an essay on urban legends, Jan Harold Brumble notes that some individuals make a point of learning every recent rumor or tale. And then you have the three periods, that's the ellipses, to show that something has been removed there. So that tells you something was removed. Okay? So if you remove something, you use the ellipses. If you add something, you use the brackets. The brackets are also used to show if you've changed something. In other words, if a word was in the original was capitalized and you don't want to capitalize it in the reusing of it in the quote for some reason, then you would put a bracket around the word, around just the one letter that should have been capitalized maybe. You would put a bracket around just that one letter that you fixed or changed. Okay? So you use brackets to show what you've added or changed. I think I might have said that backwards before, but that's how it is. You use the brackets to show what you've added or changed, altered in some way. You use the ellipses just to show when you have deleted something or left something out. Okay? And that's that. All right. There's one other thing I wanted to show you if I can find it. I'm not sure where it's going to be in here. Well, I'm not sure where it's at in here. What I wanted to show you is, the other thing I want to show you is if you are using a website or a like an online source of some kind, when it comes to doing this part here, putting the information in the parenthetical, most of the time you're not going to have a page number, right? You don't usually have page numbers for the website sources. Usually it's just a website and there's, just the website's just there and it doesn't have like any page numbering or anything. What you would do instead of that is, I'm sure it says it in here somewhere, but I'm not sure where it's at now. Maybe it's back here under basics somewhere. Let me look real quick to see if I can find it here. If you don't have page numbers, then what you would use instead would be, right here it is. in such cases, give the page number of your edition. So in other words, page numbers are always required, but additional citation information can be helpful. And sometimes, like I said, if you're doing something online, you're not going to have a page number. So if you don't have page numbers, then what you would use instead would be something like this. You would figure out what paragraph number the information was in, and then you would just put PAR period space and that number in the parenthetical, and that would be what you would put instead of it. It would look like that with a number after it, with a number right in here. So it'd be like PAR period space 2, and that would tell me or your reader that the information came from a source that was in paragraph number 2 on like the website page. And that's what you're going to probably use most of the time. If there's no paragraphing, if it just has large chunks of writing, and then maybe each chunk of writing is separated like by like major headings like this, then you would just count them as sections. And so you'd count down to like section number 2, and you would put it in here, SEC period space 2. So that's what you would do for like online sources and stuff like that don't have page numbering. Instead, you would use the paragraph number, or if it had subheadings, you would just use those subheaded sections numbers. Okay? So that's what I was looking for. That's how that works. I was trying to see if it had anything more along any examples, but I don't see any. So that's how that works. Just remember that if there's no page numbering, if it's an online source like a website page, then just go down and count what paragraph it's in, and just put PAR period and then the number in this part here instead of a page number. Okay. So as an example, like if you hit for one that has a person's name in it, it might be something like this one here. It might be, instead of Wordsworth 263, if you found this online somewhere on a page online, it might say something like Wordsworth, and then it would have a comma because you're going to be using more letters to follow. So it would be a comma here. So it would be Wordsworth, comma, space, PAR period, space, and then the number, 2 or 5, whatever paragraph number you found it in. Okay? That's what it would look like. I was going to say, I could real quickly, just to be sure you can see it, be sure it's clear. I'll bring it up here and I'll show you, just so you can see for sure that, and be clear on it. It would look like this. Let's say the last name of the author was Thompson. It would look like this: Thompson, PAR period, space, and then let's say the paragraph number you found it in was number 3. That's it. It would look like that, and then of course a period after it if it was at the end of the sentence. So that is what it would look like if it's a paragraph number. If you got it from a section, it would just be the same thing, but it would be SEC period. And that's if it had sections with their own little subheadings. Okay, so hopefully that's clear. And that's pretty much it. You just make sure that you always have that signal phrase that shows who's speaking, and you always have that parenthetical at the end, and that you always have in that parenthetical either a page number if it's a source that's like in a book or magazine that you can actually hold and flip the pages and read, or if it's an online source like a website, you might have PAR and a number in there, period and a number, PAR period and a number, or SEC period and a number. If your source is like a journal article, then that might have page numbering, so you might be able to use that even if it's online from like a database. But otherwise, if you don't have a page number to use, then just use PAR period for paragraph or SEC for section number. But you got to have both. You got to have that, and you got to have the signal phrase. And it's up to you as to whether you want to put the author's name in the signal phrase or like this one in here in the parenthetical. When you don't have an author, you go by the next thing that you have on there. So let's now do a quick example from here. So let's say that we have, I'm going to bring up another blank page here. Okay, so let's say that you have a source you just quoted, and you want to take one of these sources here to use to quote it. Okay, so you've just finished the quote, and here I'm just going to make up something here. According to Dean, one must always have, quote, their timing perfect. Whatever. I'm just making it up. Okay, so after that quote, then I've got my parenthetical. Now, think about it for a second and think about what you think should go in here. What should go in here? If I got this from a source like this one here, this is an online source because it has the URL here, right? The URL's here that tells us it's an online source, so it probably doesn't have page numbering. So instead of page numbering, I'm going to count down where I found this quote. Their timing, always have their timing perfect. I'm going to count down what paragraph I found that on. Let's say I count down the page, the website page, and I find it in paragraph 4. So what I'm going to put in here is I'm just going to put PAR period space 4. And then my final period. Now the reason I've done it this way is because I already used Dean's name here, right? In the signal phrase. Let's say I decided to say it this way. According to a New York Times article, one must always have their timing perfect. Then I have not used Dean's name in here, since that's the first thing here. If I did not use Dean's name, then I need to put it in here. So I put it in there, just like that, with a comma. Since there's more letters following the name Dean, I have to use the comma. Okay? And that's all you do. That's what it looks like. Now, what about something like this one here? This is a short film. This is like a video, a short movie that was made by Al Gore and this guy, Billy West, called An Inconvenient Truth. So notice it's the title of a film, so that's why it's italicized. Now, Dean, I didn't do anything special with Dean's last name because it was just a last name. But if I have something like this, if I'm going to do something like this one, then I'm going to have, I don't have an author now. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say something like maybe the film An Inconvenient Truth tells us much about the Earth's climate problems. Okay, let's say that's that's what I'm putting in there, and I'm just paraphrasing. I'm not even quoting. So there's no quotation marks or anything, but I still got to have my parenthetical at the end and a period after that. Now, first of all, since I've used the title, I've got to put it in the same format it's in here, right? Here it's italicized, so that means I got to go here, highlight it, and italicize it, right? Whatever it looks like here, it should look the same here. And then since that's from a film, then now what do I put in that parenthetical? Well, this is one of those times where you don't really, since there really is no way to put much of anything in there. There's no page numbering, obviously, in a movie, on a film. There's not going to be page numbering. There's not going to be paragraphing. There's not going to be sections or anything like that. So this is one time where you actually don't have to have that parenthetical. as long as you have it clear here that this is from an Inconvenient Truth. The film Inconvenient Truth tells us much. That makes it known, that makes it easy for a reader to know that that information is coming from a film instead of from you. All right? Now the other option would be to go do it this way. The other option would be a climate change, I might put it this way. One, because there's probably more than one. One climate change film tells us much about the Earth's climate problem. That's probably not even what you'd say. But anyway, just for example, if you don't put the title like I did in here, then that's when you have to have the parenthetical. So then you would have to have an income. You'd have it in there, and of course you would have it again. Has to be in the same format that it's in here, so you make it italicized here too. Okay? So just remember that whatever comes first here, is what you put in your signal phrase or in your parenthetical. I should never ever see something like this in a parenthetical here. I should never see something like something.com in here. I should never see something like Guggenheim. Or let's look at this one here. I should never see something like volume 14 in here. The only thing that should ever go in the parenthetical or in this signal phrase is what comes at the very beginning of the entry. And that's either going to be an author's last name, or if there's no author, it's going to be the first word or two or three of a title. That's it. It's the only thing that should ever be in this signal phrase or in this parenthetical. It's either going to be the first word, whether it's the first word of the last author's last name, or it's the first few words of a title. Okay? Hopefully that's clear. My throat's starting to get a little sore from all my talking, so I'm going to let you guys go. And if you have any questions about any of this, just consult the Easy Writer or look here on Purdue Owl for yourself a little bit and see if you can find it. If you can't find your answer, then go ahead and email me. Okay? Don't hesitate to email me if you have good questions, legitimate questions. But also, don't be afraid to be a little bit self-reliant. Try to find the answers on your own first, and then if you can't find them, or if you're not sure if you found the right answer, then you can ask me. Okay? I'm trying to teach you a little bit of self-reliance along with this work. Okay, so that's pretty much it for now, and I will talk to you all again soon, and hopefully everybody's getting along good with this paper. Again, any questions, don't hesitate to ask. Talk to you later.